أيها المبعوث فينا جئت بالأمر المطاع جئت شارع.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. In the name of God, most gracious, most merciful. Your Excellencies, esteemed guests, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me great pleasure to present to you our distinguished guest, Mr. Paul Findley, on behalf of Beit al-Quran and Discover Islam. The title of his lecture tonight is The Power of Israeli Lobby in the United States. Mr. Paul Findley was born in 1921 in Jacksonville, Illinois, in the United States. He is married and has 2 children, a son and a daughter, and 4 grandchildren. Mr. Findley served as a member of the United States Congress for the 20th District between 1961 and 1983, and was involved during that period in a number of reports and bills concerning important domestic and international issues. He is founder and chairman emeritus for the Council for National Interest, a director on the board of the Association to the United Democracies, a director on the board for International Food and Agricultural Development, and a former chairman of the Jacksonville Human Rights Commission and trustee emeritus, Illinois College. Mr. Findley has special interests in the Arab and Islamic world and lectured extensively on the subject, both domestically and internationally. He appeared in no less than 100 programs on radio and television to talk about Middle East policy issues, among them on NBC, CBS, CNN, ABC, and others. Mr. Findley has authored a number of books, among them The Federal Farm Fable in 1968, Abraham Lincoln, The Crucible of Congress in 1999, They Dare to Speak Out, People and Institutions Confront Israel's Lobby in 1978, translated into several languages. Deliberate Deception, Facing the Facts About the U.S.-Israeli Relationship in 1995, and Silent No More, Confronting America's False Images of Islam in 2001. He has received a number of commendations and recognitions for his life's work. I also take this opportunity to thank His Excellency the Minister of Information for his patronage of this event, as well as Beit al-Quran and its director, Dr. Abdul Latif Kanu, for letting this event take place in this beautiful building. At the same time, I take this opportunity to draw your attention that there will be another lecture tomorrow at 6 p.m. at the Gulf Hotel in the Awal Ballroom, and you're all cordially invited. Now, Mr. Findley, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for that warm and detailed introduction. This is a very happy occasion for me and for my wife, Lucille. She is guarding the back door, so no one will escape until I'm finished. We've been married for 112 years. That's 56 years each. Lucille is Roman Catholic. I'm a backsliding Presbyterian. So I'm indeed a curiosity here today to be among what I assume is an audience consisted mainly of Muslims. But I thank you for this opportunity. Assalamu alaikum. Shukran. Afwan, Malesh, Inshallah. That's my entire Arabic vocabulary. I have a superb lecture written out that I could read to you, but I believe I will leave it for history and talk just directly from my thoughts. For a moment tonight, I thought for sure I was in the auditorium of the First Congregational Church in Pittsfield, Illinois, where we lived for a number of years before my election to Congress. I say that because the front rows were completely empty. And that's true of most church auditoriums. I don't know whether you realize that or not. In fact, the total congregation of that church, when I was a member, consisted of 36 people. The auditorium was built to accommodate a crowd of at least 500, and that meant that we could guarantee an aisle seat to everyone every Sunday of the year. I don't see any aisle seats open here tonight. The topic selected for tonight is close to my heart. In my experience in Congress, which began in the year 1961 and ended in the year 1983, I became well acquainted with the lobby for the State of Israel. It was a mixed experience. I recognized the personnel of the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, which is the organization title for the group that is registered to represent on Capitol Hill the interests of the State of Israel. People of great talent, well educated, deeply committed to the cause of Israel. I became especially well acquainted with a gentleman named Ralph Nurenberger, a PhD, author of a number of books himself. He never once misled me. We became close friends. And I might add that when I wrote my book, They Dare to Speak Out, Ralph Nurenberger fact-checked the manuscript for me. He helped me avoid some missteps that otherwise would have gotten into print. And to this day, we're good friends, exchanged greeting cards during the holidays. And I have yet to receive his reaction to Silent No More, my latest book, but I hope it'll be one that he will applaud. Because I salute him as a person of commitment to Israel, but nevertheless, fairness, honesty, and honor. That's one impression I have of the lobby for the State of Israel. The other is less attractive. The lobby has effectively stamped out anything that could reasonably be called debate of U.S. policy in the Middle East. Never in my 22 years on Capitol Hill was there ever a discussion in the Committee on Foreign Affairs or on the House floor or in the Senate, for that matter, of what is best for the U.S. government and the American people in Middle East policy. That was never considered, never once. The only questions that were really examined were, what does Israel want? And when people would swarm into the doors to the House chamber, ready to vote on a pending motion, they always traditionally ask one of the staff members at the door, what's up? What are we voting on now? Because many of them are not there during the debate of a certain piece of legislation. And if the answer is, we're debating a proposition to aid the State of Israel, that's all they need to know. They say, fine, we're for it, cast their vote, yes. That is not a good tribute to the lobby for the State of Israel. Stamping out free speech in the chambers that are celebrated as a place where all major fundamental issues of public policy are disposed of, to have it known that thanks to the intimidating influence of the State of Israel, no real debate ever happens. In fact, the influence of the state of Israel through its lobby in Washington is so pervasive. It is so pervasive that the lobby wins almost every time on every issue that comes up. There are only two exceptions during my 22 years when the lobby failed to prevail. And both of them involve the sale of military equipment to the state of Saudi Arabia. Charles Percy, then the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, voted yes on one of those two propositions. That marked him for defeat because the lobby insists on purity, otherwise you're a bad guy, otherwise you have to go if there's a way to get rid of you. And of course I voted no on a good many propositions. On a couple of occasions I urged the State Department and the President to suspend all aid to Israel until Israel began to obey U.S. laws enacted to keep any recipient of foreign aid from using U.S. supplied weapons in anything but legitimate self-defense. And of course, almost every day of every year for 40 years, the state of Israel has used U.S. supplied weapons in violation of that law, but no one enforces the law. And during my rather energetic and sustained efforts to get aid to Israel suspended, Cy Vance was then Secretary of State. And the best he could bring the administration to do was to issue a letter saying that Israel may have violated the law. No real answer to the tough questions I placed to the Secretary of State, who recently passed on, as you may have noted, but who, in most respects, was a very fine gentleman, pursuing what was best for the United States as he saw it at the time. The lobby for Israel gains its influence through a high degree of professionalism throughout the United States. The main instrument of influence that's employed by the lobby is a network of individuals, maybe 3 or 4 of them in each congressional district. There are 435 congressional districts. There is not a congressional district that is without a group of key people who are firmly committed to what Israel wants, no matter what direction the course of Israeli policy may take. They are committed to the state of Israel. They are professional people. They're good at salesmanship. They establish a personal relationship with a House or Senate member. Over a period of years, they make sure that the person in office gets help when he needs it. They're always at the airport to greet him when he comes into their hometown. They can be counted on to be the chairman of the Finance Committee if needed. They can be counted on to chip in at least $1,000 every election cycle. Those people establish a cordial, friendly relationship with their representative and their senators. And what does that mean? That means that when an issue comes before Congress in which Israel has an important stake, it means that these people can be tapped instantly to make telephone calls to their representative, to their senator, and they can be counted on to say just the right things in a decent, not demanding, but decent and an appealing manner to express the hope that the representative would see fit to vote yes or no, whichever way they wanted it to take it. I had a rather instructive experience myself one day in the House Foreign Affairs Committee. We were dealing with a pending bill to provide financial aid to the state of Israel, as we often did in that committee. And I was sitting on the Republican side, of course. The the side where all the members of my party are arrayed in order of seniority. And my seatmate was a gentleman from Kansas, and I whispered to him that, well, maybe I would offer an amendment, a symbolic amendment to cut aid to Israel. I knew that an amendment like that wouldn't have a chance of passage in the House committee, nor would it have a chance of passage on the House floor. But I just made that offhand comment, not having written anything on paper, not having mentioned it to anyone else in the chamber or elsewhere. Within 20 minutes, 3 other members of the committee came to my desk, and they said with a worried look that they had heard from back home that Findley was going to offer an amendment to cut aid to Israel. And they were worried about it and wanted me to tell them about it. Well, what does that mean? That means that the representative of the Lobby for Israel, sitting in the committee chamber, had alerted the office, the front office of the lobby, about the idea that the possibility that I might offer an amendment. The lobby was able to get the information to one or more of the key people in the home district of everyone on the committee who was then in the committee room. And within 20 minutes, this whole series of calls would have occurred. And 3 of the members were called to the phone from the committee room by people in their home district who had heard about the Findley Amendment to cut aid to Israel. An amendment that never occurred. Nothing was on paper. I discussed it only with my seatmate, who for some curious reason thought it was important enough to pass on to his friend, the lobbyist for the state of Israel, in the chamber. There wasn't a thing illegal about this, but think of the impact it had on those who were involved in this episode. And it was just one episode of many. I just happened to be the center of action on that. A point I would like to make is that the doors through which these people passed in bringing about this a very effective counterattack against an amendment that might be offered are wide open to everybody else. There is no reason why the Arab American community in America or the Muslim community in America could not have the same type network throughout the entire nation. It doesn't take a lot of people. It just takes 2 or 3 or 4 in each congressional district. People who are committed to an objective in public policy and are willing to spend their time and energy and money to advance it. The pity is that there is no countervailing lobby even today on Capitol Hill that will bring the desired level of pressure upon members sitting in Congress to persuade them at least to give a second thought to the pending legislation. Now, let's assume that suddenly the Muslim community in America had these key people in every district. And let's assume that the leadership in Washington got the word out to the right people and the instructions on how to proceed in just the right fashion. Does that mean they'll change votes? Probably not. But if this happens on a sustained way, from people the representatives in Congress have come to trust and count on, politically, in election after election, it's bound to have an impact over time. I'd like to cite another example of the intensity of lobbying in behalf of the State of Israel in the executive branch. And this was told to me when I was writing my book, They Dare to Speak Out, by one of the retired executives of the Defense Department. He told of the day in 1973, in the wake of the Yom Kippur War that perhaps all of you remember. Israel had a rough time of it, thanks to the U.S. government headed then by Richard Nixon. Israel survived the assault. But in the process, they depleted their inventory of tanks and other war material, and they, of course, looked to the U.S. to resupply, as the U.S. was willing to do. The U.S., in order to resupply the inventory of tanks that Israel wanted, decided to ship them a quantity of tanks that were a bit outdated. Not outdated in performance, but outdated in the type of ammunition used by the guns on the tanks. And when the tanks arrived at Israel, they discovered that they required a certain type of ammunition. I think it was a 50 millimeter round. And they had none of that. So the Israelis sent an urgent call to Washington, please send all of the inventory you have of this particular round of ammunition so that these tanks you sent us might be useful in an emergency. Well, the officials at the Defense Department checked around. They checked supposedly every warehouse they had, any place in the world, and they sent back the word to Israel, sorry, we have no ammunition of this type. We'll have to start up production lines, and you'll have to wait until those production lines deliver the missiles that you need, the ammunition you need. Well, a few days later, the Defense Department received a reply from the State of Israel. And the reply was this: oh, yes, you do. Look in the Marine Corps depot on Hawaii, and you will find 20,000 rounds of the needed ammunition. Please ship it to us. In other words, the intensity of cooperation that Israel gets from the U.S. bureaucracy was so deep and so committed that those who were committed to Israel within that bureaucracy were able to get better information on inventories than the official chain of command. To me, that was a very sobering example of the penetration of the lobbyists for Israel, these lobbyists being unofficial lobbyists, unregistered lobbyists, who would go to that extent to serve the immediate interests of the State of Israel. In '67, during the June War, a U.S. intelligence ship, a very modest vessel, I think it was a rebuilt Liberty vessel, and it was named the USS Liberty, was patrolling near the shore of the State of Israel in the late stages of the very successful Israeli war. On the eve of Israel's decision to invade Syria, they became concerned about the possibility that this intelligence gathering ship, U.S. ship, naval ship, might learn about the plans for the attack on Syria, relay that information to the Defense Department and the White House in Washington, and thus risk the possibility that Washington might instantly enter into it and try to shut down the possibility of an invasion. Well, in broad daylight, for a period of about 4 hours from start to finish, with a bright, brand new American flag displayed on this Liberty ship, the USS Liberty. the Israeli military forces began an assault that clearly was intended to sink the ship and destroy every person aboard. They used napalm to burn alive sailors on the deck. They used torpedo boats to blast enormous holes in the side of the ship, sure that this would bring the ship down. The intelligence ship had just a couple of light weapons on board, machine guns of no consequence against airplanes or torpedo boats. Torpedo boats not only tore holes in the hull of the ship, one of them 40 feet wide. Israeli fighter aircraft even descended after the captain had ordered abandoned ship. And rubber lifeboats were put in the sea so the sailors aboard the USS naval vessel could hopefully survive. They used the fighter aircraft to shoot to pieces the life rafts so that they had no chance. Thank you very much. Well, miraculously, the USS Liberty survived. I believe it was 34 sailors were killed during the assault, and over 100 of them were wounded. But the ship survived and was able to stagger into port. The crew of the USS Liberty was ordered not to say one word about what had happened. And to this day, there has been no congressional hearing into this episode, clearly one of the worst episodes in the history of the U.S. Navy. And Lucille and I are especially pained about this because both of us served in the U.S. Navy in World War II. Lyndon Johnson was president. Robert McNamara was Secretary of Defense. The admiral on a U.S. carrier nearby heard an SOS before the radio equipment on the USS Liberty was destroyed. Heard an SOS from the USS Liberty, launched aircraft to go to defend the U.S. ship, and they were ordered back by order of President Johnson and Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. Another example of the intimidating power of the lobby for the State of Israel. Johnson didn't want to risk the possibility of Jewish disfavor because he was trying to gain support for the war in Vietnam. And he was willing to let these brave sailors who had fought so manfully to let the ship survive from this murderous onslaught. He was to let them go into oblivion, in a sense, never to tell the truth, simply because he was afraid of the reaction of the U.S. Jewish community if he did tell the truth about the episode. In preparing my book, I talked with a senior official in the Department of State, one of the many sources for my book that I promised I would not identify in print. And he told me of the remarkable discipline of the U.S. Jewish community in behalf of the State of Israel. He said as the Assistant Secretary of State for Middle East Affairs, he would have a parade of delegations of Jewish people from all over the country. One from Omaha, one from Wichita, one from Chicago, one from Boston, and so on. Series of interviews, demands to be heard by these Jewish groups. And he said every one of them was disciplined. They had a spokesperson. They were united on what they were going to say. And the recitation was the same, almost word for word, from every one of these groups, from every part of the country. demonstrating again the discipline, the commitment, the fervor of the U.S. citizens who had this unbelievable attachment to the state of Israel. Well, I don't want you to think that I'm complaining about the fact that I was defeated for re-election, mainly by the strength of the lobby. But I'd like to give you a few facts about my own personal experience. Public law required that disclosure be made about contributions by individuals that exceeded $200 during a campaign. The reports by my opponent in the year 1980 shows dozens and dozens of Jewish names that I perceived were Jewish names from various parts of the country. Some of them were rabbis identified as such, all giving the maximum to my opponent. Not a one of them had ever said hello to me. Not a one of them had ever heard a speech I gave, of that I'm certain. And yet they believed an attack against me in paid advertising, identifying me as the worst anti-Semite that ever served in the U.S. Congress. And believe me, as a result of that advertising, the money poured in. It became the most expensive congressional campaign in the history of the state of Illinois. Well, I survived the onslaught in 1980, but the Democrats came up with a much better candidate in 82. In fact, he's now a U.S. Senator named Richard Durbin, a very hard-working man. But he got a few more votes than I did out of 200,000 cast, and he was elected to the House of Representatives. I say that without malice, without regret, because had I won the election, had I been reelected, I would have been under heavy pressure. My time would be tied up day after day just trying to raise enough money to fight off the next onslaught from the Jewish community, the pro-Israel community, I should say. And I never would have written The Dare to Speak Out. I never would have written Deliberate Deceptions. I never would have had the wonderful experience of getting acquainted with the U.S. Muslim community as well as Muslims through many parts of the world. And I never would have had the motivation or the energy or the desire to try to clear up the false images of Islam that are so prevalent throughout America today. Some of you, I think, are U.S. citizens. Would you raise your hands if you are? I see a few hands. I'm glad you're here. You are remarkable among U.S. citizens because you are in a community here where Muslims are very plentiful. I dare say way into the majority. So you know that Muslims aren't all a bunch of terrorists. But believe me, I am absolutely convinced that as of today, the vast majority of the U.S. population is convinced that Muslims condone terrorism. They define terrorism to their own advantage, of course. That they condone terrorism. They believe that Muslims abuse women and treat them as private property. They believe that Islam is opposed to democracy, is opposed to the U.S. government, is hostile to other religions. Now, these aren't opinions that arise completely from avarice, from the manipulations, let's say, of the lobby for the State of Israel, that now has the need for a common enemy, now that the Soviet Union has disappeared over the horizon and has become Islam as a common enemy. Some of this false imagery is, is a result of malice. But most Americans have never in their lives knowingly had a conversation with a Muslim. Never. I was 52 years old before I had my first conversation with a person I knew to be a Muslim. I had served in Congress for 12 years. And if I had that experience, you must believe that most other Americans in my part of the country did too. Downstate Illinois has just a few hundred Muslims. Our hometown of Jacksonville, a college town of about 30,000 population, has one Muslim for every 3,000. In other words, just a half dozen. And this means that the American people draw their impression of Islam out of a depth of ignorance, as I did. I harbored rather unsavory ideas about Islam before I got acquainted with the faith. Most of the 7 million Muslims who now live in America have come there since the end of World War II. So my childhood was in an America where Muslims were almost totally unknown in any part of the country. Now there are 7 million, but most of the 7 million are concentrated in settlements, you might say, that are substantially isolated from the rest of the American community, even in a big city like Durbin, Michigan, which is a part of the Detroit metro complex. Even there, the discussion, the meetings, the cross-cultural, cross-religious relationships are seldom, almost non-existent. Dearborn has Arabic as the language of the street in many of the neighborhoods. But people elsewhere in the Detroit metropolitan area have no contact from one end of the year to another with Muslims. And the pro-Israel lobby finds that its most persuasive argument these days goes as follows. They will say, well, I know that we're being rough on the Palestinians. We regret that. We regret that we have to be that tough. But think of what we're up against. Not just the 4 million Muslims in the territories that we occupy, 4 million terrorist Muslims, but think of the millions of other terrorists surrounding Israel and the occupied territory that we have to be concerned about. We have to be tough. And it's an argument that sells very well, especially to people who are already convinced that Muslims are a bunch of terrorists who abuse women, who hate democracy, who hate other religions, who are intolerant. So the argument is powerful, persuasive. Now, is this a hopeless scene that we face? Of course not. U.S. Muslims are above average in their education. One survey that I report in my book, Silent No More, finds that Muslims, on the average, have had 2 years more higher education than non-Muslims. They are in the upper income categories. They are successful people. They tend to be professionals. They tend to obey the laws. It's almost unknown for a Muslim to be in jail. These people are more numerous than Jewish people in America today. If you just go by counting heads, they are more numerous, and therefore there is greater potential for effective political action to counter what the lobby for Israel carries out with such success. But for a variety of reasons, they have decided to sit on the sidelines. Even in the wake of 9/11, an episode that strengthened, deepened the hostility of non-Muslims who have no direct knowledge or accurate knowledge about what Islam is all about. Because the news reports have shown pictures and names and religious affiliation of the people held responsible for 9/11. And every one of them is an Arab, every one of them is a Muslim. So why would the American people not conclude that this was an act by those of Islamic commitment? And yet, with the numbers, with the education, with the financial resources, the U.S. Muslim community could, within a very few years, become a powerhouse politically. But U.S. Muslims are only now beginning to get into the political mainstream. Fortunately, I'm able to report that there are 4 organizations, each of which is devoted to getting U.S. Muslims active in the policy and partisan arenas. And they're making some gains. Just in the last election, the presidential election, Muslims not only elected several hundred people in lower offices throughout the nation, but they also were a crucial element in the election of George Bush to the presidency. Many of them are wondering why at this stage, I must say. I urged U.S. Muslims in every speech I made during that year to Muslim audiences to vote for George Bush. I did so because I felt he would be free of Zionist pressure. The Zionist money went to Al Gore, not to George Bush. For one thing, they had memories of George the Elder. The fact that he issued an ultimatum to Shamir during a big fight over whether or not U.S. guarantees would be offered for bonds issued by Israel. So it was my decision that George Bush would be by far the better bet for good leadership for the country during the next 4 years, not knowing anything about the dreadful events that would follow. And I'm not saying that they all followed my advice, but they came to the same conclusion. 70% of U.S. Muslims voted for George Bush. 70%. And the majority of Muslims in past elections had historically leaned toward Democrats for election. But they saw Bush as the hope, and they demonstrated a remarkable level of discipline by voting 70% nationally for George Bush. And in the keynote state, Florida, the percentage was even higher, somewhere up in the range of 90%. In fact, in Florida alone, 20,000 Muslims voted for Bush, and in casting their ballots, they voted for the first time in their life. So who can doubt the fact that Muslims put George Bush in the White House? That was more than 20 times the margin, just from the first-time voters, that made the difference. Well, I've painted a rather bleak picture tonight of the lobbying activity in regard to Middle East policy in Washington. And no one can question the importance of U.S. policy in the Middle East. The preeminent world superpower in the military realm and perhaps in the economic realm as well. The best trained, the best equipped military force on earth, best ever seen in history. Well, I will wait until tomorrow night to continue this discussion, but I want to leave you with a note of hope. George Bush, shortly after 9/11, became the first president in history to speak out clearly in behalf of statehood for the Palestinians. He also identified Israeli forces as the occupying forces in the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem. That was a substantial change in rhetoric that in some ways was more important than the statehood announcement, because it meant that the occupying force came under international law set forth in Geneva Conventions, set forth in the UN Charter, and in other legislative enactments through the World Court. And there, the rule of law is supposed to prevail. And if George Bush meant what he said about the forces being an occupying force, and not just some administering force, as the Israelis like to view it, this meant that they would be subject to international law. They would be subject to the rules of human rights. And yet, in his State of the Union message, George Bush spoke of the importance of extending freedom through the war on terrorism, neglecting to mention that the U.S. government that he heads was guilty, as had been his predecessors, in providing the Israeli people with the munitions through which freedom was denied every hour and every day and every year, year after year, to the Palestinian people. What hypocrisy! Then he talked about extending democracy throughout the world. And yet the complicity of the U.S. government with the State of Israel was so immense, year after year, that this complicity had the effect of denying citizenship to 4 million people. Citizenship, the fundamental key to any democratic society. Such hypocrisy. Well, I'm glad you gathered here tonight. I hope I haven't ruined your sleep for the evening. And I really believe that there is hope. I am heartened by what Crown Prince Abdullah has set forth in his recently stated plan. It is not universally applauded by Arab countries. It's not universally applauded, you can imagine, by the State of Israel. But it does raise a beam of hope in an otherwise bleak and forbidding scene. Without that, what chance would any Israeli or any Palestinian have for a better tomorrow? Israeli citizens are human beings, just like Palestinians. They surely long for the day when they can have a life reasonably free of stress without having to worry about somebody with a munition strapped around his or her belt blowing them up in some quiet street in Jerusalem or elsewhere in Israel. In 1977, a year before I had my first meeting with Yasser Arafat, I introduced in the Congress a bit of legislation that, of course, got filed away and went nowhere. But it also provided for the withdrawal of Israeli forces from the occupied territory in toto, as does Prince Abdullah's plan. But it also provided for a U.S. guarantee of the new borders. And I propose that the U.S. promise to provide monitoring military forces along the entirety of the new border between Israel and the new Palestine. I felt that was an absolute necessity to have the plan have acceptance by Israel, certainly, although probably not a necessity from the Palestinian standpoint. I had been on the committee that dealt with the authority under which U.S. troops have now been monitoring the border between Egypt and Israel for, I guess, 20 years at least, probably more. And it has been an incident-free experience. No doubt there were hot tempers on both sides of the border, but the presence of U.S. troops took care of the problem. And I believe it would have a chance to take care of the problem today. Crown Prince Abdullah didn't include that, and perhaps he thought it best that he not be telling the U.S. government what to do. I would understand that if he did. But I believe that the combination of recognition of Israel and the provision of monitoring troops on the border could turn the misery and the darkness of tonight into bright hope for tomorrow for all of the people that live on the Israeli side of the border, as well as on the Palestinian border and beyond. I know that the plight of Palestinians is the central issue for every Muslim on earth. I don't doubt that a bit. And this would bring rejoicing throughout the world. It would bring great credit to whoever heads the state of Israel, whoever heads the Palestinian movement, whoever is the President of the United States. And yet today is bereft of hope, full of bombings and death and the killing of innocent people. I can't resist telling you that, I'm sure I don't have to tell you this at all, but during Israel's murderous assault on Beirut back in 1982, more than 17,000 innocent civilians died. 5 times the death toll of 9/11. And yet there was no mourning, there was no sympathy extended in any measurable degree from America towards those victims of Ground Zero in Beirut. Quite the contrary. No sooner had those killed been buried than the Congress, and I know this because I was there as a member, no sooner did the Congress give to Israel enough money to resupply its war machine. Its war machine was supplies depleted by this terrible massacre. The day after 9/11, in Jericho of biblical fame, a group of Israeli tanks moved in, spraying gunfire in all directions, killing, among others, an 11-year-old girl. And she cried, but there were no microphones to pick up her cries. No photographs of her were flashed across the screens of America. It went unnoticed. It was the day after 9/11. And Israel had taken the opportunity during that grave moment when all attention was centered on New York City and the Pentagon, to begin its renewal of this murderous movement of firing tanks through little villages like Jericho. The Associated Press reporter was the only one who attended that grim scene. There was another ground zero that day, the day after 9/11 in Jericho, the burying of this 11-year-old girl. And the reporter noted as the tanks finished their foray, their murderous foray through Jericho, they noticed a tower of smoke and a burst of orange on the edge of Jericho. Not as large as the one over Ground Zero in New York the day before, but nevertheless a symbol of the death of innocent people. Thank you very much. Of course, sure. It doesn't matter. Okay. I get to the upper elevation now.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. On your behalf, I'd like to thank Mr. Findley for this wonderful lecture. It's a very dark picture for us as Arabs, really, and Muslims. But I think what is important about it, that he also indicated the silver lining. We would like to open the floor for some questions. We have some microphones. It will probably be better if you can take the microphone. Excuse me, we'll start from the front.
Thanks for a very interesting lecture. I think you'll see today that not everyone here is an Arab and not everyone here is a Muslim, but I dare say that the great majority, if not all, deplore the policies and the actions of Israel on Palestinian soil and in occupied territory. One of the problems which complicate the Middle East situation is the fact that Israel has appointed itself as guardian of the Jewish people all around the world. And I think that is not necessarily true. From my discussions with certain Jewish individuals, I find that there are many who deplore what Israel is doing to the Palestinians and distinguish, as many of us do, between what is Jewish and what is Zionist policy. And my question to you is, in your personal experience and on Capitol Hill, how realistic is it to expect that some Jewish people in America are opposed to policy what Israel can form, if you will, a counter Zionist lobby? And always bearing in mind that even in your own speech there was talk of Jewish lobby and not talk of Zionist lobby. And I remember last summer seeing pictures of ultra-Orthodox Jewish rabbis demonstrating in New York against Israeli policy, and they were in full kit. So can the Arab lobby, if you will, if there is such thing as Arab lobby, can it depend on an internal Jewish lobby against Israel to weaken the grip of the Zionist lobby on Capitol Hill and on the administration?
For many years, I've been convinced that the majority of U.S. Jews, and I base this on surveys undertaken by the American Jewish Committee, I've been convinced that the majority of U.S. Jews deplore, they don't just oppose, but they deplore the activities, the practices of the government of the State of Israel, as well as the practices of the lobby in their behalf. In writing my book, They Dare to Speak Out, I interviewed a lot of Jews. And I found that the intimidation by the lobby leaders of U.S. Jews is more intense than the intimidation against non-Jews. They are frightened that they will be denied social opportunities, membership in Jewish country clubs, for example, be denied opportunities in business if they speak out. Much the same reasons that so many non-Jews give for not speaking out. Even today, the organization that I helped to found, Pete McCloskey and I did it together, the Council for the National Interest has great difficulty raising money. Not that there aren't people out there with money who agree with our objectives, but they don't want to be identified in any document that might possibly become public as a critic of Israel. It's an immense problem. About the Israeli people, how can they not yearn for a better life than they have now? Many of them are leaving Israel, of course. Tourism is down almost to zero. Their economic life is being stagnated. And they almost wonder when they wake up in the morning what dreadful explosion might kill or injure a member of their family or one of their friends. It must be a dreadful atmosphere in which they live today. Years ago, when I was in Congress, I knew of a substantial number of Israeli citizens who were part of a peace movement. In fact, surveys, even at that time, showed that a majority of Israelis would support the establishment of an independent Palestine next door. And surely the numbers of such people have increased during 9/11. And surely the day will come when our president will finally recognize the centrality of the plight of the Palestinians. It's not some troublesome little sideshow to his war on terrorism. It is viewed by probably 2 billion people worldwide as the major source of concern in international policy today. Who would deny that statement? Surely you would deny it. Oh, okay. Thank you. I think I tend to respond to questions in great length. I'm sorry.
Excuse me, if try and keep your questions direct and short, please. The gentleman.
And the answer short, too.
Thank you again, Mr. Findley. I have, I guess, one observation and a question. One of the things that I have learned from this today's interesting lecture is the fact that apart from what we know in this part of the world, that one of the reasons for the power and the influence that the Jewish lobby have in the States is the media. I mean, what I've learned today is that they are also very organized and very professional, and they do their job correctly. But to what extent the media has a role in emphasizing the influence of the Jewish lobby? And the second thing that I have is we hear now and then on the TV and the radio and the press that, for example, the Secretary of State would be called for a hearing in the Congress. Now, like for example today, this is what we saw on the TV, that Secretary of State Colin Powell was called, or he was there for a statement, and he made some what we thought was very positive in favor of the truth and reality and fairness. My question is, to what extent these congressional hearings are important, and to what extent they could affect or change the policies of the United States, and whether they are really whether they're really taken seriously by the Congress, knowing that they are there, as long as it is for Israel, they will support it without necessarily knowing even the content of it. Thank you.
U.S. policy in the Middle East is often described not as foreign policy, but domestic policy. Members of Congress always have their finger up to the wind about the next election. How will my vote affect my chances of re-election? It's not a very complimentary assessment of the legislative process, but it's the truth. And until members of Congress are convinced that supporting Israel might damage their chances of re-election, they're going to continue to support what Israel wants. Sad but true. I hang my head in shame over the behavior of the U.S. Congress when I was serving there for many years and since. And I believe the day will come, provided we eventually get history books that report the truth, when a future generation of Americans will rub their eyes in dismay when they see the complicity of the U.S. government in the humiliation and destruction of the Palestinians. It may be astounding for you to hear this, but most of the American people are kept in the dark about what is actually happening in the Middle East. They don't really relate their tax dollars to Israel. If they do relate it, they rationalize it as being some sort of a debt to carry out the will of God, because many Christian fundamentalists believe that God's plan requires a strong Israel until the day of judgment. Strikes me as fantastic, just unbelievable, but they do. I had such people in my constituency when I was in Congress. I remember the day that I had talked to a group in the rural community about the Middle East issues, and a young man, a Republican who held a county office, came to me and a very worried look on his face, and he asked me to reconsider my position on the Middle East. He said, "You are opposing the will of God in what you say." And he meant it. Very serious matter with him and with millions of other people. So we not only have the pro-Israel lobby that consists mainly of Jews, but we have a Christian group, not organized in the same lobbying forum, but they all vote. And they're easily disciplined by the televangelists of our society. One bright spot that I can relate to you goes back to the showdown that George the Elder had with Shamir over the guarantee of Israeli bonds. I remember vividly the day that Bush had a little news conference, and he said, "Here am I, just one person, standing up against 1,000 lobbyists swarming over Capitol Hill, trying to reverse my objection to the loan guarantees." Bush had refused Shamir's request for loan guarantees until Shamir would agree to stop the construction of illegal settlements. And the American people were immediately with Bush on this showdown. One of the polls showed 90% support for him. I think that George the Younger can recall that moment and be encouraged by the response of the American people. He has the bully pulpit always at hand. He has enormous resources to tap, to bring about public understanding, to rally public support to his position. And if he has the will to stand up for what's best to America and explain it to the American people, I believe that he will get the support he wants to. The media role. I am troubled by his coverage of the Afghanistan war. It's as if every commentator, every news reporter is in the cheering section for whatever the U.S. government is doing in that war. The authorities have successfully kept reporters from much investigation in the field. You have to give the media credit for trying to be there. I believe that the media is better informed about Middle East issues today than it was a few years ago. I believe the dreadful assault on Beirut in 1982 was a turning point for many. I don't buy the idea that the media is simply the bought and paid for servant of Israel's lobby. My own experience on the firing line with media is that when you have a good case to present to them, they will give it fair treatment. I'm sure that's not a uniform response, but it's the response that I felt. Have I answered the question? Okay.
Mr. Findley, thank you for a most intriguing speech. Now, I'm going to refer first to your last answer, or your answer to the last question on when the elected officials in Capitol Hill feel that it is in their interest to get re-elected to support, or not, in that case, not to support Israel. But the question is here, this comes from the public, from the voters. And if I would refer to your comment on USS Liberty and draw your attention to a comment that was said by an Admiral Thomas Maurer of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the time, who said if the American people knew about how much control these people have over Capitol Hill, they would stand in arms. Why don't they, sir? Why don't they know? Not why don't they stand in arms, but why don't they know? A high-profile case such as Jonathan Pollard's case, something like the USS Liberty and others, why doesn't it get to the public in a way that would have them not necessarily stand in arms, but at least influence their elected officials? Thank you.
I think you cited an episode that is an exception. The media has never picked up the Liberty episode. Thomas More is a retired admiral that I admire very much. But he actually became chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff right after the Liberty episode. If he had seen fit to do so, he could have made a public issue of the bravery of the crew and of the source of injury and death that was sustained by many members of the crew. He did not. He has spoken up in retirement, but not as an officer who held the top military position in the United States. And I know it's asking a lot to ask anyone in appointive office, and he was appointed to that position, to brave the heat by challenging, even in this respect, the decision of the President, the Commander-in-Chief, on the cover-up of this episode. I would like to think that there are some admirals who would stand up and shout. If it costs them their gold braid, so be it. They at least would be doing a great public service.
Will the lady here?
First of all, I would like to thank Discovery Islam as well, Beit al-Quran, for presenting to us such an outstanding lecture, and I'd like to welcome Dr. Findley. In fact, I've been living in state for the last 4 years, and I'm a PhD student at the University of Michigan, political science. Also, I'm a member in ISNA, Islamic Society of North America, as well CARE. And I feel the pain for the Arab Muslim community's pain over there in the state. In fact, we have two true friends. One is Dr. Findley, and the second one is Congressman David Bonnier. And right now, David Bonnier is running for the governorship of Michigan, and in order to discredit him, already his opponents have already accused him of being an Arab Muslim sympathizer. I'd like to know what's your response here in this matter. My second question is, what can Arab Gulf countries do in support of Arab Muslim Americans over there in states? Thank you very much.
First of all, I want to congratulate you on your choice of reading material. I see you have a copy of Silent No More in your lap. You ask what Muslims over here can do. They can do a lot of things. They can write to their friends in America, urge them to stand up and be counted, whether they be Muslim or not. You can urge them to read my book. That's self-serving, of course, but the reason I spent 2.5 years writing the book was my hope that it would activate U.S. Muslims into the political arena and become a lobbying force that would help to counterbalance the dreadful domination of the lobby for the State of Israel. You ask about David Bonnier. He's one of the great heroes. He's not in Congress now. He is a candidate for governor of Michigan. He's a Democrat, but I sure support him. I'll come to his district anytime he wants me to, or any place in the state. You'll find his picture on the cover of Silent No More, along with a Republican from California, Tom Campbell, who, like David Bonnier, was speaking up as a member of Congress in behalf of the rights of Muslims and denouncing profiling and the excessive legislation that Congress has enacted since 9/11. Thank you.
One more question there.
The common feeling among us Middle East that the media in the United States is controlled by the Zionists. And this is why our message is never get through. I'd like you to comment on that. The second thing, to know your opinion, how could a very successful democracy like the United States can be subject to a lobby group that can twist facts and figures?
Well, to give an adequate answer to the second question, I'd have to read you the entire text if they dare to speak out, because that's what the book is all about. It is a chilling story, but it shows what determined people can accomplish even though their numbers may be small. And it ought to be an incentive, an inspiration to U.S. Muslims to band together and become a force for good policy in the United States as never before. Muslims can be their own worst enemy. Let me cite an example. When George Bush spoke up for statehood for the Palestinians, you would think that every Muslim in the country, every Arab American in the country, would have sent a message to the White House applauding that decision. You know that the pro-Israel crowd just smothered the White House with denunciation of what the president had to say. Well, in talking to Muslim audiences on several occasions recently, I asked them, how many of you got around to thanking George Bush in some way for speaking up for statehood? Just a few hands popped up. The rest were silent. Now, George Bush is a politician. If he gets 10,000 messages denouncing this idea of statehood for the Palestinians. And just a handful on the other side, what do you expect him to do? Go with the tiny minority that doesn't seem to care? It may be one of the reasons for what seems to be his turnaround on Middle East policy. I hope better days are ahead, though. I'm trying to stir up Muslims every chance I get, including in Bahrain.
One more question, sir.
Good evening, Dr. Findley. Thank you for your lecture and thank you for your courage and commitment for spreading awareness. We appreciate that. You said that the Israeli issue was a domestic issue, domestic policy. How does that, how do the American people reconcile with the fact that the war has been brought to their shores, so to speak, because of their foreign policy and because of their bias towards Israel? How do they accept that the actions of their government has brought destruction on their own land? And on the flip side, how does the United States basically face the other nations that are aware of this bias and the people of those nations who are aware of this blind support of Israel, now that the world is becoming a community and is no longer isolated as it was before?
Right after 9/11, I asked the congregation of a church, which I addressed one Sunday morning, to consider a tough question. Why? Why did the suicide bombings occur? Why was America alone among all the nations of the earth, singled out for this? And I mentioned that the U.S. government had been complicit in dreadful, lethal assaults on Arabs in the Middle East, year after year, year after year. And the reaction to what I said that morning was almost universally denounced. And one of my friends said, well, you needed to give them a time to mourn for the loss in New York City and the Pentagon. It's time enough later on to ask the question, why? But there have been a number of people, respected people, who have correctly noted that the only nation that has been singled out for retribution on this scale has been the only nation that has consistently supported the state of Israel in its devastation of the Palestinian people. Do most Americans see that? Probably not. The American people love their country, and in all candor, they can't imagine America doing anything wrong. And they don't recognize the dreadful misdeeds of America through its complicity with the Israeli assault on the Palestinians. They just don't accept it. And I have to admit that this is one place where the media has been of great effect. The media has deliberately avoided any commentaries that tend to pin the blame for the assaults on U.S. policy. I noted that the television media in publishing these films of Osama bin Laden in his comments on the bombings, suicide bombings, conveniently cut off comments that Osama bin Laden made denouncing the U.S. government for helping Israel abuse the Palestinians. he almost always in his commentaries has made that charge, listing it among the reasons why he felt that the assault on America ought to go forward. Now, that's no justification for what happened, but it shows it's evidence of the bias. The first report on Osama bin Laden, in which he listed his grievances, did list the assault through complicity on the Palestinians. But the same film was repeated time after time after that, and it always stopped short of including his reference to Israel.
Well, sir, I think we'll give you a break now. Thank you very much indeed for this enlightening lecture. As it is customary, we normally present our guests with a commemorative medal. I call on our chairman and founder, Dr. Abdul Latif Kanu, to present.
I welcome the gift because I usually have several Qurans on my bookshelf and frequently respond to requests for a Quran from my friends, and this will help to resupply my inventory, and I appreciate it very much.
This is our certificate, at least for you, very, very informative lectures, and to record your visit to Bahrain. And to honor you with that, we have the Medal of Major Quran, the gold medal.